Banyue is the first agent in the game to really embrace combo-based combat, blending command inputs, perfect cancels, various EX specials, and perfect play into a single agent. He's designed for players who love high action per minute gameplay, and this mix and matches 4 different combo opportunities, weaving defensive counters into your normal gameplay, and getting the most out of every adrenaline-based skill that he has access to. Every skill has its own value, niche, and situational usage, and figuring out where things belong is just one part of why Banyue is such a cool character. With this, today we'll break down everything from his kit, ideal partners, build, and so much more, but most important of all, we'll address his performance and whether or not he's actually worth pulling for. As a reminder though, footage from today's video will come from the creator beta server, so things are subject to change, but if this breakdown helped you out, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's get into it. Despite seeming very difficult and complex, playing Banyue is actually much simpler in concept. Simply generate his unique resource, buff up the team with the supports, perform the typical double chain attack combo to avoid wasted damage on other characters, then perform his ultimate, unload the gathered resources, and end things by smashing 2 stone slabs into each other. Of course, there's more to his gameplay than this, but the concept is not much different than someone like Monato or even Evelyn, both of whom we'll talk about later relative to his performance. Before we go further, however, it is worth mentioning that Banyue has many input combos that change the way he plays. That said though, I'll save the exact details for the full guide once it releases, though I will still be explaining how these combos work, as I was pleasantly surprised with my findings after testing him, since they aren't as crazy as you'd imagine. Let's now break down how Banyue's kit works as a whole, starting with his special mechanic / resource. Banyue's special resource is Wrathful Fires. It's a core part of his entire kit, and understanding how it works is very important to playing him. He generates them through different ways, and this includes consuming adrenaline, triggering defensive assist, landing parries, perfect dodges, or perfect blocks, among other options. He can store up to 150 of this resource, and once he reaches 120, he can enter his enhanced Visage of Wrath state with basic attack Immolate, or in other words, this is his charged basic. Banyue's damage is tied to his max HP though, and he converts a portion of this into sheer force. Alongside this, when Banyue enters battle, he starts with 60 adrenaline, though as usual throughout combat he also builds his unique resource through actions like consuming adrenaline, defensive assists, and again everything that I just repeated from before. To give more context though, once Banyue reaches 120 Wrathful Fire, he enters into the enhanced state. From this state though, Banyue gains Mountain's Might, allowing EX specials to replace the cost of adrenaline with might instead, while increasing his damage output too. This also allows him to chain EX specials and finish with Toppling Mountain in an automatically performed combo, but even with active abilities assigned, Banyue gains 300 sheer force, 36 crit damage, and 36 fire damage when using his EX special or assist follow-up too. Banyue's passive activates when paired with a support or stun teammate, and while in Visage of Wrath, spending might on an EX special attack, whether triggered through a normal or input enhanced version, will grant a stack of Vidya Raha, a buff that increases his fire damage by 5% per stack up to 3 stacks. As a side note though, each stack does last 8 seconds. Banyue's generic basic attack combo is a 4-hit string that deals fire damage, but what's more relevant to understand about Banyue here is that he has 2 basic related strikes even before we get into the more complicated skills in his kit. Towering Peaks is the first of his quote-unquote basic attack inputs, and this is performed when using the typical basic attack / left click input on PC. Majestic Summit is the second of his basic inputs, but this is done using his EX special as opposed to his basic. Now this might be confusing as we're talking about Banyue's basic abilities, but his EX special counts and is related to his basic skills instead. Worry not though, as this will make much more sense once we cover the special attack section. Before we do that however, regarding the rest of Banyue's basic skills, Immolate, the charged basic, lets him enter the Visage of Wrath enhanced state, Toppling Mountain is the 2-slab crushing strike that Banyue ends combos with, and Crushing Peaks is an additional input-based attack that can generate added damage if you're playing Banyue at a higher, more advanced level, but to be clear, both of these are technically finisher-based abilities, though they are still highly impactful damage-dealing skills that you just end up using at the very end of Banyue's full combo. To perform Immolate though, you simply press and hold the basic attack input when you reach the tick mark of Banyue's unique resource meter, and to perform Toppling Mountain, you press and hold the basic attack input while in the Visage state once again, assuming you have at least 120 of Banyue's resource first. Regarding Crushing Peaks, this is something usable and more input / condition related, which makes it more difficult to keep track of, but to perform Crushing Peaks, you'll need to also be in the Visage state first, perform 2 separate different EX special attacks through quick input commands, or once you've at least performed a basic string first, but I know this is a whole lot. That said, if you manage to perform Crushing Peaks, you're rewarded with an extra 756% damage scaling ability, and this is actually pretty huge. Now let's actually talk about Banyue's special attacks, as these are much different than other agents. Unlike most other DPS who can simply use a single or sometimes double cast of their EX special to deal damage, Banyue performs a different attack depending on the order he uses his basic and EX special attack abilities in. For instance, Earthshaker is his first quote-unquote EX special attack, and this is performed when he uses a basic, EX special, and basic in order after having first performed an EX special attack, immolate, chain attack, ultimate, assist follow-up, dodge counter, or quick assist. This basically means that you can use any of the upcoming special attacks I'm about to mention at pretty much any time, assuming you first use the correct inputs and don't get hit. With this, aside from Earthshaker, Banyue has access to a few different special combos, each with its own multiplier. Mountain Tremor is performed with 2 EX specials, followed by a basic attack. One's Path is available when using an EX special, basic then EX special, and Lion's Roar can be activated through 2 basics followed by an EX special again. Interestingly, however, Mountain Tremor and Lion's Roar have 2 distinct enhanced variations that Banyue can perform, but these do have specific inputs and conditions if you're looking to use them. For Mountain Tremor Wrath, you'll first have to perform Earthshaker, then quickly input EX special, basic in order to perform this enhanced higher damage version. For Lion's Roar Wrath, you similarly first have to perform one's Path, but during this you'll need to quickly input basic, EX special in order to activate the higher damage variation. Overall, each of these abilities has optimizations or ways to be used properly in a fight, but interestingly enough, just using the first ability, Earthshaker, is pretty good by itself, as the energy cost versus damage dealt is pretty efficient, especially when used outside of a stun window. Banyue's dodge abilities revolve around punishing enemies and creating powerful counter opportunities, and with this, his generic dodge ability, Immovable Mountain, lets him parry incoming attacks while remaining still, building daze, triggering a perfect block if timed precisely, and also generating Banyue's unique resource. To add to this, his dodge counter Stone Burst activates after landing a perfect dodge, and this delivers a forward fire strike that can chain directly into the third hits of his basics. Personally, however, I found the funniest part of Banyue's kit to be Battle Cry, which is one of Banyue's abilities that don't deal damage, but lets him clap with his extra hands and taunt the enemy just for the fun of it. To be clear, this requires specific inputs with your joystick/movement keys, but in an absolutely absurd turn of events, you can actually activate this taunt after his special attacks for the most goofy and silly looking Twitter clips that you've ever seen in your entire life. Banyue's assist is pretty unnoteworthy all things considered though, but since it does offer him another way to generate his unique resource, it's worth performing defensive assists back to Banyue when possible, or if you don't have a quick assist agent. Banyue's chain attack, Blazing Wrath, unleashes a large area fire strike that deals massive damage, but what makes this especially strong is its interaction with his Wrathful Fires and Enhanced State, where if Banyue has at least 120 or the tick mark's worth of unique resource when the chain attack lands, he will automatically shift into the Enhanced State immediately, letting him benefit without needing to perform an extra immolate or charged basic. Banyue's ultimate is pretty similar but at a larger scale. Once using his ultimate, this triggers a wide high damage fire attack, which honestly looks really cool, but like his chain attack, if Banyue has more than 120 Wrathful Fires when it connects, he automatically enters Visage of Wrath afterwards. This is pretty relevant and important to keep in mind if you plan on using Dylan's charged basic to force an ultimate, but as always, this is just one of the many optimizations that Banyue has access to. When it comes to pre-farming for him, you'll need 3,705,000 Dennies as usual, 300 senior investigation logs, 25 basic burn chips, 75 advanced burn chips, 250 specialized burn chips, 4 basic rupture seals, 32 advanced seals, 30 arbiter certification seals, 5 hamster cage passes, 9 crimson miasma spikes, and 60 higher dimensional data miasmic elytrons. Now let's move to Banyue's teams. In terms of teams, Banyue performs at his absolute best when paired with Dylan and Lucia, clocking in at around a 49-second clear with a 43,500 deadly assault score. This is the lineup that shines best thanks to the insane synergy, sheer force buffing, stun duration increases, and burst up time of the team, but a strong close alternative to this is Banyue, Jufufu, and Lucia, which is still very competitive. This setup landed a 52-second clear with a 40,500 deadly assault score, but this made it a reliable option if you were missing Dylan, though still wanted a high performance. On that note, you might be curious where Lighter is for a team like Banyue, Lighter, Lucia, but unfortunately his additional ability does not activate in this lineup, and his score accordingly has suffered as a result. If you're looking for a more accessible Banyue team, however, Pan Yenhu and Pulchra is a more functional, free-to-play friendly option. This team came in at around a 72-second clear with a 20,500 deadly assault score, and though it works, it's still clear that Banyue really benefits from having premium agents like Lucia, Dylan, or Jufufu beside him. This is really what makes him feel similar to that of Evelyn for me, as they are both characters who scale dramatically better with stronger teammates than the average DPS, and this is reflected of course by the gap between his free-to-play and premium possessing lineups. There are also several in-between or mid-range options that sit comfortably between the top and the fully free-to-play options, and this includes Banyue, Pan Yenhu, and Jufufu with a 67-second clear and a 29,000 score, making it a decent option if you have Jufufu but are missing other limited supports like Lucia. Meanwhile, Banyue, Pan Yenhu, and Dylan also performed strongly too, arriving at a a 58 second clear with a 32,400 deadly assault score, but neither of these of course keep up with the full premium core teams, though they are solid middle grounds that show just how much Banyue benefits the moment that you plug in at least one premium unit into your team. For more unconventional or unusual team lineups, pairing Banyue with Orphe Lighter or Orphe Jafufu was met with a 61 to 65 second clear and a range of 27 to 28,000 points in deadly assault, and similarly, even pairing an agent like Bernice with Banyue was also very competitive to those less meta teams with a score of 27,275, though its clear speed definitely took a hit at 76 seconds. Overall, my findings from having tested Banyue were that his teams do play a significant part in how well he does, as normal, but even more than usual, the gap between his premium and non-premium lineups is significant, even with a more powerful buff specific to his release. At the end of the day though, a big portion of his performance rating comes from the fight that you choose to use him in, and for certain gameplay goals or attack patterns, the randomness of an enemy or boss can completely ruin Banyue's experience, where otherwise against certain enemies like Wandering Hunter with Banyue, you're definitely able to maintain and abuse the gimmick of the boss easier and score much higher compared to other DPS. Now let's move to how you'll be building Banyue. Banyue's signature is easily his best in slot, offering a massive 30% HP main stat and a passive that grants 9% fire sheer force damage per stack up to 2 stacks. This alongside an added 20% crit rate makes this a solid stat increasing engine made perfectly for Banyue, as you'd expect, is also a great option for any HP scaler that just wants a usable passive similar to that of Heartstring Nocturne. If you're looking for alternatives though, Grillo Wisp is a solid pickup. It increases fire damage, and if Banyue's HP drops, it also gives him an additional 15% crit rate for 5 seconds. Now of course, this second passive is nowhere near as consistent or maintainable for Banyue as it is for Monato. Ultimately, it does give him fire damage, crit rate if you happen to slip up and get hit, and HP percent as a main stat as a bottom line. For free-to-play players, however, Puzzle Sphere is another usable option, but Rupture units don't usually have that many shared choices yet, though this one does do decently by increasing crit damage on EX Special, and also provides extra EX Special damage when Banyue falls below 50%. Now, of course, this isn't perfect, but it does capitalize on the parts that you'll be leaning on most, and so if you don't have one of the others, this is definitely a usable option. When it comes to drive disk setups, however, Yunque Tails is by far the strongest 4-piece option, not just for Banyue, but for pretty much any Rupture agent. The full set's 12% crit rate at max stacks combined with an additional 10% sheer force damage aligns perfectly with the scaling and makes it the clear standout. Not much guessing here though as to why that's the case. For your 2-piece slots, however, the choice here really comes down to what your build needs more. If you're aiming for more crit rate, you can definitely use Woodpecker, or any other set that gives you stats like Inferno Metal or Branch and Bladesong can work. However, I would like to talk about Puffer Electro, and despite the set being pretty good on most characters when paired with Dial-In, a friendly reminder that the attack percent from his passive and the 2-piece are definitely less useful on Rupture agents, so keep this in mind even if you end up desperately using Puffer on Banyue. For main stats, Banyue's setup is pretty straightforward. Slot 4 should always be crit rate or crit damage depending on what you need to balance your ratios, and slot 5 can flex between fire damage or HP percent. Slot 6 should stay HP percent, as this is his only real usable stat from this slot, but in terms of stat line, you'll actually be looking for roughly 18,000 HP, 50 to 60 crit rate, and 150 crit damage, with room to increase or decrease rate for damage, and vice versa depending on what you choose for your main stats. Now let's break down Banyue's pros and cons and end with his actual pull value. To start things off, when it comes to his pros, when played well, he's definitely one of the best fire DPS in the game, and with the great scaling that he has from HP, this also allows him to be tanky while still hitting quite hard, adding to both his damage and survivability at the same time. On top of this, he's also the first intentionally designed difficult character, but the payoff is actually there for him unlike some other characters, which does actually feel quite good. In addition to this though, he does share a set of gear with Monato if you built him, or pretty much any other Rupture agent too, all things considered, but despite what you'll hear about him having a difficult to master kit, his baseline gameplay is not very complex and can almost be near one button pressable once you enter into a stun window. As for his cons though, his peak performance is locked behind a fairly input and combo heavy system, and managing this alongside multiple boss mechanics can definitely feel overwhelming. Now to add to this though, if comparing high-end gameplay performances of fire DPS together, Evelyn is also pretty amazing too, and though the bosses that they share don't necessarily overlap, she's generally seen higher performances and much better play, especially if you're reaching for the high level that some Zenless players are looking for. Now aside from all this though, there just aren't too many fire bosses where Banyue shines, or otherwise you're pretty much just using Banyue for Wandering Hunter or as a means to bypass Miasma on some boss, which doesn't necessarily feel super great. With all this guys, if you're also curious about how Banyue performs compared to other DPS agents and some of his peers, or if you're curious about what this means for his pull value, here's a quick breakdown breakdown. Compared to Yixuan, he of course has a slight advantage, as most of the bosses that you take Banyue into, you wouldn't necessarily take Yixuan to. But the gap is still surprisingly large at around 5,000 to 6,000 in favor of Yixuan, even without a specifically strong buff for her, which is just a testament to how strong she is. Compared to Yidhari, however, he is certainly a lot worse, but still competitive to her, with a slightly lower 4,000 to 4,500 score gap in Deadly Assault. But as a bit of a disclaimer, this comparison feels a bit fairer and makes more sense, as Yidhari shares Wandering Hunter as a relevant shared boss. But within said fight, I actually found Yidhari to be a little bit more annoying to play as opposed to Banyue, as Yidhari technically doesn't build his mechanic nearly as easy as Banyue, but ultimately of course what matters is score, and Yidhari technically does outperform him in this case. Finally, compared to Minato, he's still definitely pretty far ahead, with his score stretching about 11,000 to 12,000 points ahead, though this is definitely something that will be affected by whether or not you have Banyue's signature W engine and how well you perform on each character. Overall, however, Banyue is not the next Miyabi, he's not the next Yixuan, and that's okay, as he's clearly designed currently to fight against enemies who are incredibly aggressive, have miasma, or are fire weak. As a result, if you're someone who's lacking other fire DPS, have access to Lucia or Dylan, and don't care for any upcoming characters, Banyue is a solid choice. In addition to this, if you feel like challenging yourself, Banyue is certainly difficult to master, but does reward you with a decent performance and score if you manage to do so. At the end of all this though, we still have already seen teasers for what's coming in 2.5, and this could make you worried about whether he's worth it, so ultimately you could also just wait for an upcoming livestream before pulling, or do as you like as always. That's going to be everything you need to know about Banyue, however, a brief breakdown of how he plays, the goals for his gameplay, and the teams that he performs great with. However, as always guys, thanks again for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Stay safe, stay healthy, good night.